I was doing an interview with Simon Wiesenthal, the famed Nazi hunter. I think Laurence Olivier played him in the movies. And he was telling me how there were Nazi war criminals living in the United States and Canada. And I said, come on, I don't believe it. He said, well, you know, your country has a number of war criminals and your government refuses to do anything about it. I said, well, give me one name. He said to me, go to the library and buy a book called Wanted, Nazis in America by Howard Bloom. Turn to page 228. It documents the crimes of Harold Spontulis, whereabouts unknown. Find him. I spent the next year in pursuit of Harold Spontulis, and I found him. I found him gardening. And as I investigated his life since 1938, found out that he was convicted in absentia of murdering 5,000 innocent people during the Second World War. And I documented every step this son of a gun took. I proved it was him. I got his Gestapo pass and I matched the birth date with his driver's license, and I matched the signature with his mortgage. So I knew conclusively it was him. I even confronted him. And then I went to Washington to do more research, where I got a lot of stuff on him that proved without a doubt he pulled the trigger. And I remember in particular reading one story from a survivor, because the United States Justice Department collected all this stuff. Canada had nothing. Canada wanted nothing to do with these Nazis. They just wanted to ignore them. But the Americans kept good records, as well as the Soviets, believe it or not. The Soviets were very, very helpful, and their documentation was right on. And one story that I read told of how Harold Spontulis ordered one of his officers to pull the trigger on a 12-year-old boy. And he did, but the boy wasn't killed. So Spontulis grabbed the gun and shot the boy himself and killed him. And I remember when I heard that story, I started to shake, because I was going to kill Spontulis. And then while I was in Washington, I found out about another Nazi called Helmut Rocha, who, as a Gestapo officer, murdered 11,000 people. So I had the goods on two Nazis, who coincidentally, believe it or not, lived about a mile away from each other. And I used to wonder, do these two know each other? So I went to the Canadian government, and I said, I have the goods on these two Nazis. Arrest them now. I was ignored. So I called the Prime Minister's office. I called the Justice Ministry. I called the Solicitor General. I called the RCMP. I called Immigration and Passport. And I said, I know these Nazis. Here's where they live. If you don't arrest them in 7 days, I'm going to tell the world that they're here and you know it. And you're going to give them a chance to escape to Paraguay on your watch. So that was a Monday when I did all that. Monday night, I'm at home with my wife Annie, finishing dinner, and the phone rings. Who is it? It's Alan Waters, the owner of Chum. I didn't even know if he knew who I was. I mean, I worked at Chum at the time. This was not really a Chum story. I planned bigger things with it. I planned to do a major article that, you know, all of Canada would read. But Chum was paying my dime, so I was going to do a story on Chum Radio too. So Alan Waters calls me up, and I'm why is he calling me? He says, Jeff, what are you working on? I said, well, Mr. Waters, I'm working on a story about Nazi war criminals. He said, well, what have you got? I said, well, I've got the goods and the documentation on two criminals who murdered together 16,000 people. He said, okay, full steam ahead. What happened was he had got a call from his liberal buddies in Ottawa, because it was the Trudeau government at the time. And Trudeau wanted nothing to do with the Nazis because it would have been the right thing to do, and Trudeau didn't want to do it. And his justice minister at the time, Jean Chrétien, didn't want any part of it either. That's why the Americans gave me everything. They should have been giving everything to the Canadian government, but they didn't want it. And the Americans were so pissed at Canada, that's why they gave it to me. Anyway, I did my work. Within 4 days, Helmut Rocha was arrested, sent back to Germany for trial after about 32 years of living freely in Canada. And then the other Nazi, Harold Spontulis, just as my story is ready to go to air, I get a phone call from somebody who says, "Jeff, did you read the obits today?" Now, this was a person who knew what I was doing. So right away my heart dropped because, like, what could that mean? So I got the paper, I looked at the obits, and sure enough, the son of a bitch Buntulis was dead. I didn't believe it. He knew I was after him. I didn't believe he was dead. Funeral was that night at Jarrett Funeral Home at Young and Shepherd. So I said to Annie, I'm going to the funeral. I don't think he's dead. So we go to the funeral, and I wanted to make a statement. So I went in a t-shirt, ripped jeans, with this. And they all looked at me as I walked in. It was clearly evident I did not belong. And then at the end of the service, I still didn't believe he was dead. So I went to the coffin and I opened it up. And he was in there. And I remember being angry at that time because the son of a bitch escaped justice and went on to live as a free man in Canada. And then as I stood there looking over his body, this sensation came over me that he didn't escape justice, because at his final send-off, I was there on behalf of the 5,000 people he murdered. So his crimes were not forgotten. Fittingly enough, after the funeral, his body was shipped to the crematorium across the street.